If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun.
About 77 years ago, during World War II, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was faced with a dilemma. He wanted legislation that would allow him to help his allies, yet keep the U.S. out of the war. The compromise that allowed him to do this became known as the Lend-Lease Act. In 1929, the stock market crash on Wall Street caused the United States to go into the Great Depression. This was only 10 years before the start of World War II. The United States was in no place to join in on the fighting. The U.S. was not ready for another World War, so in 1939, when World War II started, the United States kept its distance and left the fighting to Europe. They would not stay too far away for long, though. The Lend-Lease Act would start in 1941, and they would join the war later that year. The idea of the Lend-Lease Act did not just pop into Franklin D. Roosevelt's head. There was a person that was very often telling him that the rest of the world needed his help in World War II to fight Nazi Germany. This man's name was Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945. Churchill could not simply purchase goods from the United States. Like China at this time, Great Britain was having a hard time being able to pay for these kinds of things. FDR was reluctant to give out help. With the people of the United States pressuring him not to enter the war, and the U.S. just leaving the Great Depression and finally improving their economic situation, Roosevelt was unsure if helping other nations was the right call. Eventually, in 1940, Churchill was able to convince FDR that the British and the rest of the world need his help. The Johnson Debt Default Act, put into place in 1934, said that the goods bought by other countries from the United States had to be paid for. Roosevelt needed a way around this because he wanted to help out his allies who could not pay for the things they needed. Roosevelt went to Congress and asked them for money to support places fighting against Nazi Germany, proposing the Lend-Lease Act. Named this because the United States would lend things to other nations, and then those things would be returned when they were done being used. This is the first page of the actual Lend-Lease Act itself. Congress said that they did not like the Lend-Lease Act. They wanted our allies to pay back for the things they received in cash, not by returning the same thing they received like Roosevelt proposed. Making the nations pay the United States back would not work though, and Roosevelt knew it. Great Britain did not have enough money to pay back for these things. It was bankrupt. That same year, in December, an urgent Roosevelt asked the United States to become the arsenal of democracy.
The great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war.
The arsenal of democracy was a request made to the people of the United States from the President to start stockpiling weapons to provide to the other nations. The last thing that Roosevelt said in his Arsenal of Democracy speech was, "As President of the United States, I call for that national effort. I call for it in the name of this nation which we love and honor, which we are privileged and proud to serve. I call upon our people with absolute confidence that our common cause will greatly succeed." President Franklin Delano Roosevelt believed that as a whole country, we could help out the other nations we were allied with. This speech started a conflict over how much America should be a part of the war. Nonetheless, America provided for their allies. Although the arsenal of democracy would help, Roosevelt knew he needed more and continued to push for the Lend-Lease Act.
And we will not tell them that they must surrender merely because of present inability to pay for the weapons which we know they must have.
The act became supported by most of the public, although some people still had their doubts, saying that this would bring the United States too close to the war for comfort. Still, the Lend-Lease Act was passed by Congress with a vote of 60 to 31, and in the House with a vote of 317 to 71. It was put into place in March of 1941. The amount of money given to this program initially was $7 billion, but by the time it was done, had actually used more than $50 billion, with $31.6 billion going to Great Britain, $11 billion going to the Soviet Union, and the rest being dispersed among about 36 other nations. The efforts of the Lend-Lease Act started to take place immediately. The United States was sending things like food, weapons, equipment, and much, much more. The first people that benefited from this new act was China and Britain. The transfer of arms in the Lend-Lease Act played a very significant role in the safety of the United States at this desperate time. It helped Great Britain and the Soviet Union hold the forces of Nazi Germany back for quite a while, allowing the United States to stay away from the war, feeling more comfortable in their allies because of their new weapons. At this point in the war, the United States and Great Britain were benefiting from each other more than ever, although they didn't want the rest of the world to know that. Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly in ships in the Atlantic, where they composed the Atlantic Charter, first made public on August 14, 1941. The fifth point made in this is, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing, for all, improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. This is very significant to the ideas of the Lend-Lease Act, because they are saying that they wanted to have a lot of collaboration between nations in economic advancement. The Lend-Lease Act continued to be very effective in this war, but wouldn't be needed for much longer, because on December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. More than 2,400 Americans were killed and about 1,200 injured. The United States could not just sit back and watch anymore. They entered into World War II. During World War II, an average of 27,000 people died each day, until Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, after the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Although the Lend-Lease Act was most effective during World War II, it actually helped with the aftermath of the war too. The Soviet Union and the United States had a lot of conflict and disagreements, and Roosevelt knew it. To attempt to put the conflict at ease, he used the Lend-Lease Act to support the Soviet Union and make them happy with the United States. In addition to its help with the Soviet Union, post-war, the Lend-Lease Act was able to help with the idea of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was named after the Secretary of State at the time, George C. Marshall, and was used from 1948 until 1951. Through it, the United States gave over $13 billion to Europe to help their economy recover from World War II. The Lend-Lease Act was no longer needed and came to an end in 1945 by Harry S. Truman. Although not widely known, the Lend-Lease Act kept the United States out of the war where 27,000 people died each day. It allowed Franklin Delano Roosevelt to stay out of the war for a good amount of time, but still be able to help out his allies who desperately needed it. A special thank you to the kind people at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. who helped me in my research.